of this session is Evolving Landscapes, Navigating Past and Future Pathways in Payment for Ecosystem Services Programs. And we have three presenters today. So the first one is going to be Mauricio Galeana from Centro Geo. He's going to present in Spanish, so if you need any translation, please tell us or we'll solve it. And the slides will be in English, so please, Mauricio.
Okay, firstly, I apologize for presenting in Spanish, but my English is very, very, very bad. So it's better that I speak in my mother language. So voy a platicarles justamente de este proyecto, de este trabajo que se enmarca en un proyecto internacional, justamente con financiamiento de lo que es el Ministerio de Ciencia y Tecnologías de Francia y el CONACYT de Estado de México. Y en ese sentido, este proyecto tuvo por propósito el analizar las dinámicas o las trayectorias socioecológicas de lo que son 4 cuencas, una en Francia, en el Valle del Maurin, donde el principal driver o dinámicas que se encuentran en esas cuencas tiene que ver más con la dinámica agrosívo-pastoril y con ciertas presiones hidrológicas. En el caso de Colombia, en la cuenca de Río Grande, donde predominantemente las dinámicas que ocurren ahí se contextualizan en el marco de la ganadería. Y en el caso de México tenemos 2 áreas de estudio. El Copalita, que aquí tenemos a la coordinadora justo de esa parte del proyecto, la doctora Sophie Ávila, donde tenemos una dinámica más asociada a la presión por turismo y a la presencia importante del sector cafetalero. Y tenemos la Ciudad de México, que es justamente el trabajo que voy a platicar. Un poquito más de contexto de este proyecto. Obviamente el marco analítico con el cual fue la guía pues, para poder elaborarlo fue el de sistemas socioecológicos. Y eso con una idea justamente de identificar cuáles son las presiones de cambio que pueden estar ocurriendo en estas cuencas, sobre todo en términos de 2 estresores, el cambio de suelo y el cambio climático. Y todo esto cómo se envuelve en términos de vulnerabilidad. Y el proyecto tenía estas 5 grandes fases, un poco operacionalizar o conceptualizar lo que serían los sistemas socioecológicos en cada una de las cuencas. Otros 2 fases asociadas a ver cuáles son las transiciones o los cambios en servicios ecosistémicos y las trayectorias históricas en términos de contexto histórico, para poder integrar esto en análisis espaciotemporal y poder tener como proyecciones futuras y un poco testear, digamos, estas teorías de cambio que se generaron dentro del proyecto. Y todo desde una visión interdisciplinaria. Y en ese sentido, como les adelantaba, yo les voy a platicar del área de estudio de Ciudad de México. Que la Ciudad de México, como ustedes saben, pues es un monstruo de 9 millones de cabezas, ¿no? Donde si integramos justamente su área metropolitana, pues somos del orden de 24 millones de mexicanos por ahí, y donde principalmente estamos siendo afectados obviamente por la expansión urbana, por la invasión de asentamientos humanos irregulares, de tal forma que el área como tal de estudio que estuvimos trabajando son 4 microcuencas de esta zona que se le conoce como el suelo de conservación. Que el suelo de conservación surge justamente como una iniciativa ante esta presión de la urbanización acelerada que estaba ocurriendo de los 70s al 2000 para establecer esta área donde convergen una diversidad de elementos agrícolas, convergen también ahí muchos pueblos originarios, es el hogar de aproximadamente 2 millones de habitantes y tiene una importante relevancia para los ciudadanos de la Ciudad de México para nuestro coexistir, dado que alberga un buen porcentaje de biodiversidad y se provee una diversidad de servicios ecosistémicos donde destacamos obviamente los hidrológicos y toda esta dependencia que tenemos. Y en ese sentido, como les adelantaba, pues tiene esta cuestión de la presión de la urbanización y otros elementos como la tala ilegal, los asentamientos humanos irregulares. Hay temas políticos en torno a la regularización de estos asentamientos humanos irregulares que se vuelven capital electoral de muchas de las administraciones locales que tenemos al momento de que hay elecciones. Tenemos problemas de sanidad forestal, tenemos problemas de enfermedad también por contaminación atmosférica, dado que el parque vehicular es muy importante en Ciudad de México. Y obviamente cambios de uso de suelo asociado con la agricultura. Y en ese sentido, como les adelantaba, a partir del año 2000 se define esta área de conservación, es aproximadamente 88,000 hectáreas, y de ese tiempo para acá pues, ha venido la implementación de una diversidad de políticas federales y políticas locales, principalmente asociadas justamente a la preservación, conservación, mantenimiento de servicios ecosistémicos y algunas muy orientadas a las cuestiones agrícolas. En ese sentido, estos son algunos de los ejemplos que se han implementado a lo largo del 2000 para acá, destacando obviamente el pago por servicios ambientales, con énfasis en lo hidrológico, y pagos de servicios ambientales en términos de fondos concurrentes. Cabe señalar que en promedio anualmente a esa área del suelo de conservación se le inyectaban 149 millones de pesos en términos de todos estos programas. Ahora vamos a ver la relevancia cuando platique los próximos pasos de por qué enfatizar esta cifra. Entonces, en el marco del trabajo nos concentramos en estas 4 microcuencas donde convergen algunos núcleos agrarios, como se ve en el mapa superior de la izquierda, y convergen una diversidad de instrumentos de política pública, que van desde áreas naturales protegidas locales, estos fondos concurrentes y el programa de pago por servicios ambientales. Y en ese sentido, en el marco justo de este proyecto, pues nuestro propósito fue analizar cuáles son las trayectorias futuras en esta área periurbana y un poco ver cuál es el efecto que está teniendo estos instrumentos de política pública ambiental y mecanismos de compensación en esta área. Esto bajo 2 principales preguntas. Uno, en términos históricos, ¿cuál ha sido esas trayectorias socioecológicas? ¿Qué factores han estado asociados con cambios o con las dinámicas que ocurren aquí? ¿Y cómo podría ser justamente las trayectorias futuras, considerando el efecto actual de estos instrumentos de política pública ambiental y mecanismos de compensación? En ese sentido, el primer paso fue justamente hacer un análisis de percepción remota, tener como probar diferentes métodos de clasificación supervisada para poder tener las representaciones más precisas de esta área de estudio, y posteriormente a través de talleres interdisciplinarios donde había especialistas de diferentes áreas, líneas de investigación, disciplinas que tenían conocimiento local en esta área, definir cuáles pueden ser como los principales impulsores de cambio, los drivers, que tenemos presente en esta área. Se definieron algunos drivers asociados a las características de la Tierra o elementos biofísicos, como los clásicos de pendiente, altitud, temperatura, distancia a ríos, etc. Se definieron un conjunto de drivers asociados a lo sociodemográfico, otros a la infraestructura, y se definieron como los factores institucionales en términos de las políticas públicas, justamente estos 3 instrumentos que he venido platicando. Posteriormente, quitando justamente los factores institucionales, se corrió un modelo con el Ancient Modeler, que integra, digamos, redes neuronales y cadenas de marco, un escenario tendencial o el business as usual, hacia 2039 de cómo podrían ser estos imaginarios en torno a estas 4 microcuencas, y se creó un escenario alternativo o restrictivo a partir justamente de la integración de este índice con los instrumentos de política pública ambiental. En este índice, ¿qué tenemos? Pues por un lado, el tiempo de permanencia o estabilidad que una hectárea de bosque ha estado apoyada por alguno de los instrumentos, el efecto que ha tenido en términos de la deforestación histórica, o sea, que tanto ha contenido espacialmente ese píxel, y M está asociado a la inversión, cuánto ha sido lo que se le ha inyectado. Y todo esto pues ya se estandarizó, se normalizó y se generó una capa, que es la que se refleja acá, de tal forma que lo que está en más verde tiene un mayor efecto de contención, y lo que está en rojos es lo que ha tenido un menor efecto integrando estas 3 dimensiones. Aquí lo que vemos son, digamos, los resultados de las clasificaciones de uso de suelo y vegetación, como En muchos trabajos se ha documentado, o sea, tenemos este patrón donde hay un incremento de la agricultura a costa de la vegetación y posteriormente esa agricultura pasa a ser algún tipo de asentamiento humano, ya sea regular o parte justamente de la mancha urbana de la Ciudad de México. Aquí tenemos el análisis, digamos, de drivers a partir de la B de Kramer, de cuáles son más significativos en términos de las trayectorias históricas que ocurrieron en esta zona, destacando, bueno, cómo se interpreta un poquito esto de la B de Kramer. Pues los que son significativos, generalmente, de acuerdo a Eastman, es de punto 15 para arriba. Entonces, los que no estaban aportando a los modelos se sacaron tanto para la modelación tendencial como para el escenario alternativo. Y ahorita voy a retomar la importancia también de estas temáticas. Y en ese sentido, aquí lo que estoy mostrando es justamente los dos escenarios, el restrictivo y el alternativo, donde hay una diferencia aproximadamente de 822 hectáreas de un área completa que abarca como 20.000 hectáreas, aproximadamente una cuarta parte del suelo de conservación, que es el efecto de contención que en la incorporación o en una efectiva protección de estos instrumentos de política pública pudieran ayudar a contener justamente en esta área tan dinámica. En términos de las preguntas, algunas de las discusiones que arrojó este trabajo, como les adelantaba, pues la clásica historia de deforestación por agricultura y de agricultura para pasar a asentamiento humano irregular. Esa ha sido como la principal historia que ha estado ocurriendo en este segmento del suelo de conservación. En términos de los drivers, el que más se destaca es justamente el de infraestructura. Y esto tiene relevancia cuando esto lo metemos con las famosas teorías de middle range, que justamente publicó por hace poco, en torno a que parece, dado el peso de nuestros drivers, que se acerca más la dinámica a lo que es la teoría justamente del recurso de frontera que se plantea ahí en el trabajo de Mayford, donde la accesibilidad justamente es lo que detona muchos de los principales agentes de cambio en la zona. Otros dos trabajos para contrastar, digamos, en términos de los drivers que he participado. Uno, por ejemplo, tiene que ver con este modelito que hicimos, pero ese se concentra mucho en la parte suroeste de la Ciudad de México, donde está Santa Fe, que digamos es uno de los principales focos económicos de la Ciudad de México, ¿no? Donde ahí lo que se ha encontrado, o haciendo esta comparación de drivers, ahí está empezando más los temas biofísicos o las características de la Tierra, cayendo, digamos, en otro tipo de teorías para explicar la dinámica encontrada. Y este otro trabajo que trabajamos, pero está principalmente orientado yendo como hacia Hidalgo, hacia Pachuca, donde ahí los drivers que estuvieron más relacionados eran justamente los sociodemográficos. Y un poco esto para contrastar, desde que estas tres son áreas periurbanas de la Ciudad de México, cada uno de los factores está teniendo diferente impacto. Un poquito en torno a hablar sobre la limitación del pago por servicios ambientales, creo que eso se va a tocar muy a detalle en las próximas presentaciones. Hay mucha discusión que podemos llevar, pero sí me gustaría irme con la idea de que justo en el marco de trayectorias socioecológicas, los estudios de cambios de suelo le dan como esta mirada fresca a algo que ya parecía muy agotado, ¿no? En términos de los recursos asociados al cambio de suelo, ¿no? Entonces, muchas gracias, aquí le detengo, si no me aviento más rollo.
Thank you very much. So, since we have only 3 presentations, so we're going to follow the 3 of them, and then we will have a discussion and a questions session. So, the next one is Santiago Izquierdo-Tort. I think they're going to put your presentations. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everyone. That works. Thanks for being here. So I'm very happy to present today results from this study that we've been conducting with many colleagues, including some of the colleagues in this room. And it has to do with understanding, like, what do we know after 20 years of PS in Mexico, both from the research part, but also the implementation part. This is part of a broader project, a set of questions that we've been developing to do with trajectories. So after 20 years, or even more years in some cases like Costa Rica of PS, what can we know about trajectories? Like, beyond effects, what are these policies actually doing? What is the conversation happening in terms of the research, and how these two interact? So we noticed that by studying this, we're opening a set of questions that are also relevant, becoming even more relevant as time goes by. So what are PS? This has been covered in many sessions in this conference already. But in a nutshell, it's payments in cash or kind. And this is key, it's some sort of condition. And the condition can be either the provision of ecosystem services or a proxy. And there was a conversation by Esteve, his keynote this morning, on what are some of the pitfalls when you pay for ecosystem services versus a proxy like forest conservation. And I think this is important in terms of policy, as it's placing an increasing role in the increasing emphasis in the role of markets or incentives as a form of conservation policy that is very different from other previous approaches. So why do they matter? They have been globally expanded, and these are some numbers, and I think we already require an update from this paper in 2018, which shows hundreds of programs, billions of dollars, and importantly, these programs have been implemented, have been incorporated within the broader frameworks, including the recent targets in the 30 by 30. So they're becoming relevant, they're becoming implemented, and additionally, there's been a lot of research interest. And tracking the debate, what have been the different positions in terms of the research, what we've been seeing is that we have polarizing debate. We have people who we can put in camps as detractors and promoters who have very, very different views about what these policies are and whether they should be pursued or not. And what we have been doing with my group of colleagues is to say, okay, beyond the debate, beyond the theoretical debates around what PS are or should be, what they're actually doing on the ground, what do real pests look like, and how can we learn from underground experience, and basically thinking about whether we can make theory from the bottom up rather from the top down. So with the last 20 years, what we can see is different trajectories, and this more relates to public pest programs that are financed and led directly by governments, many times with the use of public funds. So we see these three different contrasting trajectories. So policies that have been relatively stable in terms of funding implementation, like the case of Costa Rica, and I think I would only position the case of Costa Rica here. Some recent interest, but growing interest in some regions or countries like Colombia. And then we have these cases of instability. So cases that large programs, many publicly financed, that are facing some implementation challenges. It has to do with changes in discourses, in policy priorities, in funding, changes in design, and so forth. And this is the topic of this talk today is, so what has happened to the case of Mexico? And this kind of broader set of questions that are opening now is, so what affects long-term trajectories, both implementation and research? What are some of the most significant effects and processes beyond these short-term impacts and on effectiveness and additionality? And how do research and implementation relate to each other? So we have seen relatively little research on this topic, and it seems to be key, at least in our paper. And so we hope to have an open conversation in this emerging set of questions linking research and implementation. So, just in a nutshell, Mexico's famous for existing services programs. So it's been running since 2003, and it has different components. So a national level program, mostly for hydrological services, and I think Robert will talk about this. Then we have other subnational and local schemes. What has been the emphasis? Forest conservation, so payments for forest protection rather than the provision of a specific ecosystem service. So as a proxy that if you conserve forests, you're going to have all these other ecosystem services. Short-term contracts that are many times renewable. What we've been seeing is that many communities finish their contract and then they can reapply again, but this is very dynamic. So opening really interesting things happening there. Payments per hectare, usually around $50, depending on the exchange rate. And critical aspect is collective enrollment. So it's from 60 to 80%, we don't know for sure, of forests are collectively held by communities or ejidos, and most enrollment takes place in the context of these ejidos or communities. So our questions here are what? So what do we know about patterns of both research and implementation? What have been the research priorities and some of the reported effects? Is there consensus on outcomes or not? And basically, what do these things show in terms of gaps in our knowledge and both practice? So what did we do? We reviewed as much literature as we could. So peer-reviewed literature, and importantly, we have some of the global databases in English, like Scopus, Cielo, but we also gathered some bunch of literature in Spanish to recognize that there's a lot of literature that's not always recognized in these global reviews that are only in English. So we took this approach to select, and we ended up with 150 publications, and we'll show which ones are in Spanish and English. But we also reviewed the implementation. So from public databases from the Forestry Commission that implement this program, what have been the patterns of implementation? So we contrasted both. So some key results. Firstly, Mexico is one of the largest and most studied programs worldwide. So this shows what you see in these colors is the patterns of implementation, and these are the different components. So national components, the hydrological program, biodiversity program, other national, and more like smaller or subnational programs. And what do we see here is a significant growth in 2006, 2007, relative stability, and since 2017, a lot of volatility. So it has to do with changes in priorities, that funds are negotiated every year. So some years are really high, like 2021, but other years are really slow. On average, it doesn't seem to have been diminished significantly. This was surprising for us because we always thought that the program was going down, but it seems that it's not down, it's more volatile. So what does this mean for communities who try to enroll in the program? And we have many communities that have continuously participated or are dropping out and then reapplying again. So a very dynamic patterns of implementation. And what you see in these bars, these are the number of publications per year. So it kind of tracks, but with a delay, 2-3 years delay in terms of the number of publications per year. And what we observe is it seems to be less interesting for science or for academia. So a lot of research, 150 publications, 7.4 million hectares in 13,000 contracts, and this is 3% of a national territory of a big country, so a very extensive program. But what do we know? Implementation volatility, less annual publications. So it seems that the program is going down, both in terms of academic interest and also in terms of implementation. Second result, what does this research show in terms of research priorities? So there's been a lot of interest on the national program, which represents 48% of implementation. So it seems to correspond the interest on the program that is more important. But there's been a lot of growing attention on local matching fund schemes, which are these much more local initiatives that try to get financed through other types of means that are not necessarily public funding, or that can have a different interaction between the federal government and local governments, which have been getting a lot of attention, but more attention in terms of research than implementation. So like overly studied, you can say. What does the scholarly research say about outcomes? So there seems to be consensus that the programs achieve mostly positive ecological outcomes, but when we look at social outcomes, particularly on equity, it's much more mixed. So I think this resonates with other reviews in other programs what you presented this new paper by Sven Wunder and colleagues, showing that modest gains, both in economic terms, socioeconomic terms, but also ecological terms. And what we showed is that there has been a lot of disciplinary and methodological diversity. A bunch of impact evaluation studies, a lot of case studies more from the qualitative perspective, and increasingly studies that look at longer term trajectories, taking advantage of a lot of years of implementation. But what we saw, and this was really interesting when we found it, is despite a nationwide implementation, most research has concentrated in certain states, and within these states, it has been concentrating in certain regions. So some of the people here in this audience have been contributing to this part. A lot of interest in Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Veracruz. So this represents like the bulk of studies, and certain regions within the states. So why is this research taking place in these places? It has to do with connections, the ability to conduct research, and we found that some of the states, particularly in the north, not a single study in 11 states. So this already shows that you can have a lot of research. That doesn't mean that you're covering some of the gaps, at least in geographic gaps. And this is something that was really surprising for us. 24% of the programs and the contracts are in these 11 states, and we have not a single study in the north. And the third result is that a lot of contribution by authors in Mexican institutions. So we have over half of publications come from Mexican institutions, followed by the US and Spain. Some of the authors are here. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the language of publication, it's really different. So 49% of publications by lead authors in Mexico are in English versus 97%. So if you only take into account publications in English, you will be missing out a lot of publications from authors in Mexican institutions. And 7 out of 10 institutions with the most number of PS publications are also based in Mexico. So it seems to be like a large community of authors in Mexican institutions contributing to PS. But what is the other side? And this contrasts with this recent study by some colleagues also in this paper, showing that there is an asymmetry in knowledge production and implementation with a lot of Global North scholars studying programs in the Global South. But if we look at influence as measured by number of citations, we see that publications by authors in Mexican institutions are much less influential, you might say, in terms of number of citations. So less studied, and this difference persists even if you control language, the place where the publication outlet, the journal, and the theme. So what is going on here? So some takeaways. More research does not necessarily fill these knowledge gaps, and we see this particularly when we look at geographic diversity in terms of publications. We need to understand better what's going on in the interplay between research and practice. So we see it seems to be that research is following practice in terms of documenting what's going on in terms of implementation, but are there channels for the opposite, for research to contribute to practice? And an inadequate influence and recognition of in-country scholarship as measured by number of publications. So what does this have to do? Does it have to do with research networks? Who is collaborating in these studies? So a lot of opening questions, and looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Santiago. We'll have at the end of the questions. So we're gonna follow with the Robert Manson presentations.
Muy bien. Thank you, Santiago. Excellent presentation of the general patterns in Mexico. And I'm going to focus in on the center, the state of Veracruz. We're one of the guilty ones that's been maybe overstudied, but trying to distill out a little bit of the information from that that might be relevant to evaluating these programs in the future, trying to identify indicators, groups of indicators that may be particularly useful for giving feedback to the program operators so that they can improve the program over time. And the project that led to all these publications was an NSF project that tried to look at the net effects of payment for hydrological services in watersheds in central Veracruz. And the project tried to move beyond kind of the simplistic linear thinking of operation of PHS programs. For example, that you're going to create a program, you're going to have participation, you're going to create the stimulus to participate with a financial payment that's going to positively affect forest cover and management, and then you're going to have your hydrological services. But we all know that if you conserve for hydrological services, you're also affecting other services, and there's a lot of feedbacks in the system affecting the socioeconomic and perceptions of participants, and so it's really a complex sociological system. That's how we went about studying this in central Veracruz. So one of the main motivating factors behind the project was this observation of kind of an iterative cycle of you're creating programs In theory, you have monitoring, and that gives you take-home messages on how to improve the program over time. So iteratively, the program should be improving if you have good monitoring. But when our project started, we were noticing the publications coming out like Brower, 47 studies all around the world showing that 70% of the studies were monitoring forest, but only about half used hydrological indicators. And then in Mexico, a study by Saldaña Herrera in 2013 with these local matching fund programs, 60 of them, found that only 50 were monitoring forests and less than 5% were using hydrological indicators. So this focus on indicators was really important for us. So as a first step in the project, we did a literature review and we tried to organize these indicators of PHS performance in some broad categories: biophysical, socioeconomic, and governance, with the caveat that they were easily measurable, that they provided meaningful results, and they were sensitive to changes like land use change. And then to test that, we went out into the field and we did an extensive field study from 2014 to 2018. And the objectives, particularly in the focus of this talk, were to identify key indicators providing the most robust and meaningful data for understanding PHS program impacts, to highlight key challenges and offer some recommendations on how to apply what we've learned in an indicator framework to improve monitoring and evaluation of these types of programs in the future. So our experimental design was to work in 2 catchments with active local matching programs in central Veracruz. So the pink there is the Pisquiac watershed, providing 40% of the water to Jalapa, and then we have the Gavilanes providing about 80% of the water to Coatepec. And within these catchments, we identified micro watersheds, 8 in particular, corresponding to 8 land uses. So we had mature cloud forest, we had advanced secondary cloud forest, we had young cloud forest, we had a traditional and intensified shade coffee, we had extensive and intensive pastures, and we had sugarcane as the main crop in the area. And so within those micro watersheds, we monitored the biophysical aspects. And then in terms of the socioeconomic and the governance indicators, we worked in the surrounding landscape. And the particular indicators that we looked at were land use change, various hydrological parameters, plant biodiversity, carbon storage, in terms of socioeconomic indicators, willingness to pay, social networks, changes in household benefits and perceptions due to the programs. And in terms of governance, the financing mechanisms, the administrative structures, decision-making, and the local context. So I'd like to start with kind of the typical way that these programs are evaluated, which is through patterns of deforestation and additionality, but then highlight that we kind of tried to work at this using multiple scales. So the first analysis we did was within those 2 catchments that I mentioned. We used matching with parcels with and without payment for hydrological services, and we observed that there was reduced deforestation in the parcels receiving PHS, but these were mostly in areas with reduced deforestation risk, so the additionality was relatively low. Then we repeated this, but working with a moving window approach, kind of a more landscape approach, and with difference in difference methods, and we found that there was reduced deforestation in landscapes with reduced deforestation risk. So again, the additionality was a little bit low, but interestingly, we found that there was 41% higher effectiveness in areas where the payments were concentrated versus where they were kind of sparsely distributed. So there was some kind of crowding in effect going on at the landscape scale. Looking at variation between ecosystem services and land use land cover types, what we did is we identified a group of indicators that helped us describe the responses in terms of ecosystem service provisioning, in terms of hydrological flow, water quality, carbon storage, and biodiversity. And what we found is there were some synergies. So when you had higher, for example, annual low flow, that was positively correlated with carbon storage and with biodiversity. But then a lot of the indicators for water quality were varying independently, and sometimes those would create trade-offs. And then if we look at the responses of different land use types on this kind of suite of ecosystem service provisioning, the black line there, you can see in these spider diagrams, that is mature cloud forest. That was our reference. So if you were past that line, it was positive, and if you were below that line, it was negative. So basically, you can see that the other two forest types that are in here more or less were mirroring the mature cloud forest. But then when we get into coffee and pasture and sugarcane, they just couldn't provide the same suite of ecosystem services. So, and a final kind of message on the biophysical part was the marked site-specific variation in the effects of land use, land cover on this gradient on ecosystem service provisioning. So we ordered our sites here from low intensity to high intensity, and then we looked at the suite of ecosystems or indicators of ecosystem services, and we found in some cases there was what we expected, more service with less intensification. Again, here with soil conductivity, but when we looked at other variables like high flow and runoff, we were getting a lot of variation. It was difficult to detect significant patterns. And so we went back and looked at what was going on here. And one of the messages is that we found all cloud forests are not created equal. So if you remember, when this program was created in Mexico in 2003, the focus was on cloud forests because supposedly it had capture of cloud vapor, right? But it turns out that the fall condensation in this area is less than 1% of the total precipitation versus up to 32% in other regions. So it makes it so that you can even have other land uses like pasture that has higher annual flow because it has lower evapotranspiration. So that's important to consider that all forests are not equal. And then also we had high infiltration capacity of soils. So that made that pastures sometimes in normal rainfall events, they could be acting like forests. But then when there was these extreme events like what you see here, then you would get higher peak flow. So here's the higher peak flow in the pasture. And then because there wasn't the infiltration and the recharge of the groundwater, you had lower base flow in the dry season, so you had higher drought risk. So the soils and then just the changing microclimates in these regions were kind of noise in our analysis. So in terms of the socioeconomic indicators, we divided this up in three areas. So the perceived benefits were significantly greater. And just to clarify, this was with 186 landowners using matching techniques, so some with payments and others without. And there was significantly greater perceived benefits with PHS payments. And the benefits that they perceived mostly were conservation, followed by trust and community collaboration, and finally economic benefits. We also found fluctuations in participation as a function of deforestation risk, which is a surrogate of opportunity costs, and land ownership. So the private versus the communal owners had different motivations. So the private landowners were interested in conservation, whereas the communal owners were interested in kind of fitting in with what everybody else was doing. And in terms of impacts, material versus non-material impacts, we really found no material impacts. There was one significant result for cattle for private landowners. But in general, the payments represented only 8% of annual income, and they were used for things like health expenses, household infrastructure, ag inputs, and reforestation. And in terms of non-material benefits, I want to emphasize this. There was a significant effect. Participants viewed higher quality of life and community participation with PHS. So that was interesting. And then finally, looking at the governance indicators, we found when we did surveys of using directed choice experiments with willingness to pay in Jalapa and Coatepec, these cities that are paying these programs, the payment amounts were surprisingly high, that what they were willing to pay, 16 and 70% of what the water bills were in these cities, but it really depends on the local context. So, for example, the degree of understanding of the hydrological process and the importance of the forest, the trust in local government, the participation of local NGOs or not, and for example, the case of Coatepec, if payments could be made to protect shade coffee, not just forest. So that was that result. Then we had to kind of look at the feedbacks and the effects of stakeholder participation in payment programs. We did role-play simulations with scenario modeling, and we found that it significantly improved knowledge, ecological knowledge, hydrological knowledge, willingness to pay, like understanding of the points of view of the other actors in the watersheds, and also their negotiation capacity. And also, we observed some possible policy implications. For example, this scenario modeling, looking at possible futures where you're targeting high areas of high deforestation risk. But that results in more payments in areas of young forest, and you're losing carbon and biodiversity with that type of targeting. So trying to attack problems of additionality, you may be sacrificing other ecosystem services. So finally, we worked at the national scale, and we looked at, we did a regression analysis with 147 matching fund programs all around the country, and we identified a series of variables, this describes the nature of the relationship, that best explain the program emergence and program persistence over time. So for program emergence, it was opportunity cost, wealth, institutional capacity, collective tenure, and protected areas. And for program persistence, it was wealth, institutional capacity, hydrological function. It had to be, poor hydrological conditions, and the presence of non-government actors like NGOs. So what can we conclude from all this? That due to the trade-off, synergies, and surprises we detected, we think it's kind of risky to take the results from one watershed and try to apply it to another watershed. So the monitoring efforts should be largely site or region specific at least. And if you can't do that, then the next best thing is to focus on forests. We generally saw that the forest, whether it's mature forest, intermediate, or young forest, it was providing the best suite of ecosystem services. So conserving them in general will help ensure the overall ecosystem service provisioning. Then in terms of indicators at the landscape, at the regional and the national level, that can also help improve PHS performance over time. And finally, that the active participation of local actors in these programs could help ensure the healthy development of the programs. Of course, really strengthening these feedbacks in the PHS programs, focusing on non-monetary, not just monetary, but non-monetary impacts can be really important. Willingness to pay, it seems like a really good variable to be looking at, not just for telling how the program is performing, but also providing money for the program. So the amounts of money that we found that they're willing to pay is much higher than what they're actually paying. So these programs suffer from financing. They can't pay in areas of high deforestation risk, but using willingness to pay might make it more interesting. And then finally, monitoring with a baseline is much easier than doing all this work to work backwards in time and seeing what the impact is of these programs over time. So programs need to set a baseline and do the monitoring from the start. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so now we can open to questions. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that you guys are doing. I think it's super relevant. So thank you. Just to share a little bit of why I'm asking this, I'm a funder. I work in the carbon market space and how it intersects with territorial rights. And I've been shocked by how little thinking is going into the structuring of payments and how that relates to social cohesion. So I'm wondering, you spoke a little bit about it in your presentation, but I'm wondering, I don't know what the actual modality of payment is, whether it's delivered to families, or whether it's organized at a community level, and how payments are combined with in-kind benefits, or how that's set up. But could you just share a little bit more about that, how these payments are set up, and what we know about their interaction with social cohesion?
Okay, you wanna probably Santiago and
Sure. So, like this, most contracts or the application is done by communities, like as a kind of an institution, and within these communities, the funds are distributed depending on who is enrolled, what is their kind of land tenure arrangements, and the distribution of funds depends on the community. So they can choose how to distribute the funds. In some places, what we've been seeing in some studies in Chiapas is that distribution has a lot to do with land arrangements. So if most lands are, like, let's say, individually held, the money tends to go to those people who submitted their lands to the program. If it's about communal lands, that also happens in other contracts, then funds are typically used for, like, let's say, kind of public investments, like schooling or so forth. So it really has to do with how the communities decide to distribute the funds, and there's really little tampering from the forestry section. There was an interest in, and I don't think that rule is still there, the reinvestment rule. So there was a requirement for communities at some point to reinvest the money in defined things that the Forestry Commission put into place. But at least in some regions, created a lot of resistance because communities were saying, okay, I'm sacrificing converting to other land uses, particularly for cattle ranching. So that rule was dropped in some places. But just kind of to conclude, most contracts are signed by the communities who represent either the entire community or a group of people within the community, and the funds, they have maneuver over how to use the funds. So in some cases, it replicates the land distribution. So if land is distributed really unequally, and the funds tend to replicate those structures. So it can go either way, depending on the diversity of land and the distribution of funds.
Hi, this is also for you, Sandy. One observation from reading PES literature for over the years is that most PES programs around the world were like GIZ funded, or IED came in funded for 5 years and now they've disappeared. So the Mexican case is particularly interesting because it has sustained for so long. And I understand that, I think that's because of the tax-based approach that's used. But as someone who reads only the English, not a Spanish speaker, and you highlight that there is a gap here, that the Spanish language publications are not getting as much attention, what is somebody missing then? What is there in the Mexican literature on the PSAH program that one reading the English language literature does not get to read and understand?
So what we saw is, two things. We also found that Mexican literature, also in English, is less recognized. Even in the same journals, same themes, kind of same approach, it's less studied. So if you run like an analysis controlling for all these other things, it's less cited. So that's kind of puzzling. The other is, if you look at Mexican literature, it tends to be more like local case studies. So you're losing kind of that diversity, like underground diversity in some places. English literature, at least tends to be a bit more kind of theoretical too. So Mexican literature in Spanish is more case studies, and English literature is a bit more diverse. But what was puzzling for us was to see why everything else constant is less cited, even if Mexican literature has a lot of other contributors. So we only control by who is the lead author and is it based in a Mexican institution or not, and it turns out it's much less cited. So we're still figuring that out, what's going on.
I have a question also for Santi. Santi, when you showed this gap of research in the north of the country, there's something you did not explain, and I wonder whether you think this may be relevant to explain your results, which is that the program always has these NGOs or individual consultants who act as intermediaries between the program's money and the communities themselves, right, and the applicants. do you think that maybe in the northern states these intermediaries tend to be more individual forest consultants, that they are registered under the CONAFOR, while maybe in the south you have more local NGOs, and therefore these NGOs have networks of researchers that collaborate with them, while this more sort of individual consultant approach in the northern states also makes this collaboration with researchers more difficult. I don't know. It's just a hypothesis, but I don't know if you've thought about it and you've tested it.
We haven't tested it. It could be the case. I think like some hypotheses as for why the South is more studied. Some of it has to do with kind of the conditions that make research like interesting. So indigenous communities, high biodiversity, contact with or like previous like networks and access to these places. So I think that kind of explains. Those are some of our, at least based on our own experience conducting research in these places, has to do with those things, like pre-existing like availability to conduct research, but also interesting factors like are also interesting for academia. In the north, it could have to do with that could be one factor. It could also have to do with violence, and this is one, like the less access to these regions as a place of study. But we don't know for sure. That could be one of the factors. But there could be others.
Just to think about this a little bit, it's a hypothesis, but also these programs tend to work best, and they're modeled after kind of watersheds where surface flow dominates, right? So, and you get most rainfall from the middle of the country down. And so in the north, very sparse rain, and it goes straight down into the aquifers. And I've actually had some problems with these programs that try to mirror the programs in the south in the north, when the real problem is the overexploitation of the aquifer, and they think that they're really resolving that problem by reforesting or something like that.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm wondering, how are you thinking about disseminating this work, but for the policy implications, but not only at the national level, but at the international level? I just came from COP16 in Colombia, and many people were talking that these programs doesn't work, and in Mexico it's not working, but your results are showing completely the opposite. So how are you planning to disseminate this in more like international, like policy driven yeah.
Well, the study works, but it's expensive. So unfortunately, we found that it's really hard to do a study of cloud forest in one area and then generalize about cloud forest in another area. So that means that it's going to require money. But in terms of policy, there's different levels. So one of the things that happened in Mexico in 2010 was that they allowed these matching fund programs where 50% of the money comes from the local source. Up to 10% of that money could be used for monitoring. And almost none of the programs have taken advantage of that. So there's something in the mentality of the decision makers, at least in these programs and probably nationally as well, that it might be a little bit of, they don't really believe that this is going on, that, investing in nature is going to provide them better water quantity and quality. There's a little bit of greenwashing or something going on. Because if they were really serious about it and they viewed this as a contract between users of water and providers of water, you want to have the monitoring. If you're not seeing the result, why are you paying? So there's always the risk in Mexico that some citizen, some water user raised the hand and said, show me that my payment has had a positive effect. And so if you don't have the monitoring, you can't say anything.
Yeah, so part of the motivation for this study was to take stock. So what do we know? If you look at single studies, you can show there's a lot of diversity. Some places are very effective ecologically, others ineffective. There's all these studies on social economic dynamics showing problematic issues to do with leak capture, unfair distribution, and so forth. So part of it was kind of taking stock national level, like what do we know, and in our role as researchers to say this is what literature kind of suggests, if there is consensus or not, and then from there, like at least get that information out to show like first like this diversity, but also some patterns of research and to what extent are researchers converging in some aspects and to what extent they're not, but also showing what is less studied and what needs further attention. And for us, it was the North and other topics that we didn't cover in this talk but are in the manuscript.
Is there any other intervention? Okay. So I think we are on time. Thank you very much. And if you have more questions, please go ahead.